It's The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. And joining us, Georg Blume, Paris correspondent for German publication Die Zeit. How are you, sir? I want to welcome as well Reem Mumtaz, France correspondent for Politico. Do we just say Politico? We don't say Politico.eu and Politico.com?
Yeah, just Politico.
Just Politico, okay. Catherine Norris-Trent, senior correspondent here at France 24. It's double team coverage today from our own staff.
A surprise development.
A surprise development.
Surprise!
Here he is, Douglas Herbert from our International Affairs Desk. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. Before we look at some of what's been happening around the globe, let's begin here in France. France, which has endured a lot since 2013, but a rampage inside of Paris police headquarters by one of the own staff members of the men and women in blue. That's a first. Thursday's knife attack by a civilian employee of 18 years in the IT department, leaving his superior and 3 officers dead before the alleged assailant was gunned down in the standoff. Catherine Norris-Trent, the latest is that this has 24 hours later been handed over to an anti-terror prosecutor. Took a while for the case to be given to anti-terror magistrates.
Yeah, and that's really interesting in the timing, because sometimes it just happens straight away if it's very obvious that it's a terrorist attack. Here, the police and the prosecutors were very cautious. They didn't want to whip up any fear surrounding this case. And for a long time, police sources were telling us it's just a very confusing situation. We do not know what's going on. We don't know what the motives are. And there were lots of different rumours going around, whether it was an internal dispute, perhaps even a love affair gone wrong, or perhaps terrorism. So it looks like that they are going down that road now, although they're still not 100% clear, apparently, according to the sources. It's not a cut and dry case. It seems that they've got this information after their investigation. They went to the attacker's house, the attacker who was gunned down. They went and searched his belongings. They've gone through his computer, and apparently his text messages on his phone, which are pointing them down this route. His wife is still in police custody being questioned, so perhaps some information coming out from her. It's being a tightly guarded investigation. As you can imagine, it's extremely sensitive for French police. There's a lot of sadness, shock and anger among there, and so this has really hit them extremely hard.
Hit them extremely hard. Several French media reporting that he'd converted to Islam 18 months ago. But again, no motive is confirmed at this point. Nothing is being said publicly about this.
No, and I think it's very interesting that the weekly bulletin that comes out of ISIS, El Bayan, came out this morning and made no mention of this attack. And there has been no claim of responsibility by ISIS, claims of responsibility that we've seen much faster in previous such attacks. So it's really difficult to say either way what actually motivated him. And I think we should be very careful about associating a conversion to Islam with sort of becoming a terrorist.
And I was just going to point out on that point, France's government spokeswoman basically said exactly the same thing yesterday before this was formally transferred to the anti-terrorism unit, saying, listen, let's be very wary of what she, called fake news, and that is jumping to this rush to judgment just because this happens to be someone who converted to Islam 18 months ago does not necessarily mean you have to connect the dots to say this is also a person who's been radicalized and is poised at any moment to commit a terrorist act. But because Paris is on edge, there's almost, we've called it almost a psychosis before, and especially in France, whenever you mention these words, the anti-terrorist prosecutor, it's a trigger for a lot of French, and not just for ordinary French, but also us journalists, for people in the French media. If you watch the French stations, they immediately sort of switch into this new sort of reporting mode. The whole story takes on a new tone. It's no longer, just a criminal case. Tragic, but just a criminal thing, an internal dispute. Now it's potentially terror. And a psychosis kicks in a sense.
And that actually feeds into what terrorists want to do, really. It's to spread fear and terror.
Which was so scary about that story. It happened in the center of Paris, in the holy Palace of Justice in, where violence just shouldn't happen.
Across from Notre Dame.
Exactly. But, as when I came here, we didn't know there was this investigation into terrorism yet. I looked up the number of homicides in France, and it actually came down the last years. It's 807 for the last year. We should also report on, violence getting less in our society when we have a feeling, it can be everywhere, and in that Palace of Justice. And that was good news, actually, which we should think about, even at this time.
That bit of good news can be qualified this week because the rampage came one day after France's biggest march by police in nearly 2 decades. They complain they're overworked, under stress, and they sounded the alarm over the 52 officers who've committed suicide since the start of the year.
The yellow vests led to an overwork situation. Many police officers worked 17 or 18-hour days on Saturdays that completely disrupted their social and family lives. Police officers have been personally named and targeted on social networks. They have been threatened with death and insults. We realised it even went beyond that because it affected the police officers' families and everyone around them.
Catherine Norris-Trent?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see that you interviewed there Philippe Capon, who's one of the union representatives for the French police. And I actually interviewed him in the wake of the November 2015 terror attacks. And he was saying then, a few months after that, when there was this state of emergency that kicked in, that already the police were stressed. He was saying a lot of them had PTSD and they were working long shifts. They cancelled holidays. There was a huge personal toll. And that is continuing. We've had a wave of these terror attacks, unrest, protest, the Gilets jaunes, yellow vest movement there, and as he said, 52 police suicides since the beginning of the year. There have been other demonstrations like this by the police as well, saying they are just overworked, they can't cope anymore. This one was a big one. The police union said 27,000 police officers are on the streets of Paris, so it is a big deal for them.
And there's this feeling for the police that it seems to change on a dime, because we all remember after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, people spontaneously breaking into applause. Police officer had been among those killed at the time. And with the Yellow Vest movement, it's a different story.
The Yellow Vest movement, I think, really kind of exacerbated that animosity toward law enforcement that exists in French society. The Saturdays of protests have been extremely violent on both sides in terms of what the protesters have done, but also some of the response by the police. Even though, the police says, they're overworked, they say there are millions of overtime hours that haven't been paid and there are still accumulating, that they're in the streets for 17, 18 hours at a time, just standing, being confronted with so much violence from civilians, and then having to also exercise a lot of self-restraint. I have to say, when I covered the Yellow Vest protests, coming from the US, I was expecting a bit more of an aggressive approach by French law enforcement, and was actually pretty impressed by their self-restraint.
And yet what gets played over and over is images where there is violence by police. Those do the rounds on social media, Georg Blume.
Well, I was on that demonstration on Wednesday together with my 2 children who are 6 and 4 years old, and we saw the police demonstrating with their blue flags and balloons, big balloons in the air. With all, of course, there's all this complaint that they suffer too much and that there's too much violence. But this demonstration was all about what is good in France, so peaceful, so civilized, so well organized, the people so free to speak out about their own problems, to show who they are, where they come from the different cities of France. They all had their local flags, and I mean.
It makes you wonder.
I think that's what works best in France. You had that terrible situation of civil violence with the Yellow Vests all year long, and then these police officers are able to express themselves, their anger, their peacefully, democratically, and everybody listens. And I can even go there with my children, and it's fantastic.
It really makes you wonder why the Yellow Vest protest became so violent, because it's true that protests in France normally can actually go on in a pretty civilized way.
One final thought on this. Police aren't the only civil servants under stress. Thursday saw teachers march in Paris's northeast suburbs after the suicide of a 58-year-old primary school principal. She had left a 3-page letter describing her burnout, too many administrative tasks, too much stress. This is a primary school principal, Catherine Norstrand.
Yeah, it's an extremely sad story here, but it brings to the head again a lot of teachers in France, so they're under a huge amount of pressure. And this woman was the head of an école maternelle, a nursery school, ages from 3 to 6, and she just said that you don't get the support you need as compared to other higher levels of education. And she was just having way too much work. And I've spoken to other teachers in France, and they all say they're overworked. I know quite a few who've had burnout.
As we enter into what could be a big challenge for Emmanuel Macron, pushing through pension reform. Again, there's always questions about where is the welfare state taking care of its own. We complain because there's too many people on the public sector payroll, but we complain as well when we unravel that welfare state.
Right, exactly. And you know, French people do love to protest, and there are always protests, but it does seem to be touching something different. There are these professions, police, teachers, who really, a lot of these people are suffering, and they're at the heart of the French state. And there's education reforms being pushed through at the moment, which are very unpopular with teaching staff as well. So I think Emmanuel Macron's going to have a difficult few months of it.
All right. Just when you thought you'd heard it all, Dateline, Washington, D.C., the South Lawn of the White House.
China should start an investigation into the Bidens, because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine. So I would say that President Zelensky, if it were me, I would recommend that they start an investigation into the Bidens.
Have you gotten used yet, Doug, to the new normal in Washington?
You never really get used to it. There's a sort of outrage fatigue or whatever, where the needle has moved. We've definitely, our sensitivity, our sensibilities about this have been blunted, and it has been a real effort and an exercise.
I remember you on election night, and you were so shocked, but now you...
It's an effort now you have to constantly remind yourself, no, this isn't normal, and to try to keep your focus, especially if you're trying to report this story. But, look, what do we see there? As one Democratic observer remarked, Donald Trump is essentially impeaching himself. He's standing there. You can argue whether or not you agree with that. But in other words, by essentially going public, saying publicly that he is essentially soliciting, doing exactly the thing for which he is being investigated for doing in private, allegedly doing in private. He's trying to legitimize, he's trying to normalize, he's trying to soften, whatever word you want to use, but he's trying to essentially turn the tables on his accusers by going so public and being so open about it. He's almost trying to make a mockery of the charges themselves and to say, not only...
And it could work. It could work.
Well, it can very much work.
He's got a Republican-controlled Senate that won't agree to throw him out of office.
He said as much today. During that exact same appearance with Marine One droning on in the background, he's gotten very adept at these helicopter droning press conferences. He said, yeah, the House Democrats might have the votes to start that impeachment inquiry. He's acknowledging that, but they will pay a political price for pressing forward with this impeachment process.
Reem Mumtaz, remember 2 weeks ago you were in New York, right?
I was, yeah.
When Nancy Pelosi hit the trigger on the impeachment proceedings. And since then, we've had, the Twitter profanity, calls of treason against senior lawmakers on Capitol Hill. What do you think, looking back on on those 2 weeks?
I mean, when I was in New York and that news broke, it did feel like a big deal. And everyone sort of stopped talking about the UNGA and started talking about impeachment. Even foreign leaders started talking about this impeachment kind of move. But I think that we... by other standards, by any other standards of another time, this would be incredible, unbelievable, extraordinary, whatever you want to call it. But we are in the Trump era, and I think we should be really careful about getting carried away. Let's see if this is going to be sort of the thing that actually gets him impeached, first of all. And second of all, what happens after impeachment, if it happens? I think we cannot measure it by normal standards.
Well, it goes to the Senate is what happens.
Yeah. And then what? I mean, you have to ask this question to the Republicans. And I think the Republicans today are still solidly behind him, even though more and more American people, there was a poll actually in Politico yesterday that showed that more and more Americans support impeachment. But is that enough to move the needle within the Republican Party? I don't think it is right now.
It isn't. It hasn't been, right?
Yep.
Not one Republican in the House, I'll just point out, has come on record supporting this inquiry, and only 2 in the Senate have mildly rebuked the
Which is
president.
why he's so emboldened, and he comes out and says things like China should also do it, and what's the big deal? He's, he knows.
I think, first of all, it's a very good defense strategy, taking that out into the open. And then, it's not because of a call to an Ukrainian with whatever, you say or think that an American president is going to get out of his office. No, it's not going to happen. And we should be serious. It's us media also who just jump on that case and love to talk about impeachment, or trying to be Bob Wilson and what was the other guy's
Bob
name?
Woodward.
Exactly, Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. We all dream of it, and no, it's not going to be this time. It's not it.
All right, a lot's changed since 1974. We now have the internet and 24-hour news channels like this one. Stay with us. We'll pick up on this point when we come back. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. We're in the company of Georg Blume, Paris correspondent for Die Zeit. With us as well, Ray Momtaz, France correspondent for Politico. And we have Catherine Norris-Trent, senior correspondent, and also blessing us with their France 24 presence is our own Douglas Herbert. We were talking before the break about how a lot's changed since Watergate. But you could say that this week has begun to see the sketches of something Georg alluded to, which is a segment we could entitle All the President's Men, because it's not just Donald Trump who's getting sucked into this. Far from the acrimony in Washington, there was the Secretary of State, for instance. He visited the land of his ancestors, had an audience with the Pope, a tour of the Pompeo family village in the Abruzzo, a visit, by the way, to the Colosseum in Rome, and the admission that, yes, the U.S.'s top diplomat did sit in on that phone call, the one with Ukraine's president back in July, Catherine Norris-Trent.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of distraction going out here, like all the different ways in which they can communicate on this, they're going for it. I think there's a really interesting parallel if you look back to Bill Clinton's impeachment. And while that was going on, his strategy, his administration's strategy there was pretty much to try and stay as calm as possible, to try and stay focused on the middle ground, to try and get across messages on policy, despite the noise that was going on at the time, and to work through it. And it just doesn't seem like that's what the Trump administration is here soon. They're going for, fire and fury, to coin a phrase, going for as much noise as possible, getting it all out there and hoping people get fed up of it.
And as Douglas Herbert was saying in part one of our discussion, both sides sticking to message. We saw Donald Trump's envoy to Ukraine on Capitol Hill Thursday, veteran diplomat Kurt Volker, who resigned last week after revelations he had put Trump's personal lawyer, Rudolph Giuliani, in touch with relevant Ukrainian officials. Now, despite leaked text messages on how much pressure is being brought, opinion on the closed-door hearing that took place, well, it ran strictly along party lines.
I can tell you that, any comments that would indicate that there was some nefarious purpose on behalf of this president was not backed up by the facts today.
You have more and more evidence that the President of the United States was improperly using his office, using our taxpayer dollars to leverage help from an ally in our upcoming 2020 election.
So each side will just stick to script and on to the elections in 2020.
It makes you really wonder, do they speak the same language and are they reading the same messages? I don't know, but it does seem like no matter what you put before them, it is going to come down to party lines. And as long as that's the case, there is no moving forward either way.
During Watergate, there was no Fox News or there was no internet.
But we're also hearing reports from the US now that all this buzz about Trump and Biden helps Elizabeth Warren as a third way candidate in a way, and that she's profiting from this all this fake news or news or whatever it is?
Well, it's undeniable that Trump's strategy, at least for his hardcore base, it does fire them up. And it's worked for him in the past. You know, you first deny any wrongdoing. You never admit you've done anything wrong. Then you go on a counterattack. And not just any counterattack, you tear into your enemies. They are traitors, perhaps punishable by death. You hint at that. They are spies. They are conspirators. They are fake news. They are losers. Then, after you've gone on the counterattack, you start muddying the waters. You cloud the waters, you obfuscate. You spread either misinformation or disinformation or a little of both, but you make people confused enough that people who don't follow the news very closely and don't know all the details, well, you know what he's saying? Okay, maybe, who knows? I mean, there's his side and there's the other side. And then what happens? People get the fatigue we were talking about at the beginning, and people's attention starts to wane. They want to move on. It's the war of attrition. Trump knows it works. It's worked for him in the past. It worked for him with the Mueller inquiry.
All right, speaking of competing narratives, Tuesday saw a 70th anniversary birthday bash for the People's Republic of China. It was months in the making, complete with new military hardware, 15,000 goose-stepping troops, 100,000 civilian participants in the pageantry in Beijing, and a further cementing of Xi Jinping's grip on power, except activists in Hong Kong braving a protest ban with police for the first time using live ammunition and seriously wounding an 18-year-old during violent scuffles. It's gone up a notch, and it's gone up a notch since this Friday. Hong Kong's beleaguered executive, who was in Beijing, by the way, when it all happened, she's responded with a face mask ban at protests.
We believe the prohibition on face-covering legislation will be an effective deterrent on radical behavior, and it will also help the police enforce the law.
We have our choice to wear the mask or don't wear the mask. And the Hong Kong police, they're also wearing the mask when they're doing their job. And they don't show their pass and their number. We can't complain there anymore.
Where's this all going, Goldblumer?
Well, there was one good thing this week that Xi Jinping, during his allocation in Beijing, said he's keeping to the old, deal with England, one land, two systems for Hong Kong. And that means they're not going to send the army there or intervene militarily as far as it goes now. And, the real danger is there that the hardliners in Beijing who must be also there and very upset about that situation, which is really not face-saving for China. I mean, they lost the battle of images there this week when they wanted to really reign in the world, and they're going to be very angry about what's happening in Hong Kong, and I think in Beijing there's a real power struggle going on now. How are we going to keep on that line that Hong Kong police is doing the job, or are we going to do ourselves something?
Right, and we've seen China's economic rise, but it hasn't been accompanied, Reem Mumtaz, according to a survey that was done by the Pew Research Institute, with a rise in soft power. In fact, the popularity of China seems to have gone down in the Far East. When you were at the UN week in New York, China's leader wasn't there. Hong Kong is really more than just a fly in the ointment at this point.
Well, it's interesting because I think China sort of goes by its own standards as well and has always wanted to sort of open its own path. They're not so much into soft power in the Western way of thinking, but they've been projecting a lot of power economically through their Silk Roads initiative, and they've been able to sort of implement themselves in various parts of Africa and the Middle East, and they're expanding that way, and that's what they're focused on, and that's what matters to the people in power in China. And I think we should also sort of assess China on those terms as well, not just kind of through the Western prism. What is also super interesting is to see how circumspect the West has been about the protests in Hong Kong, and how shy they've been about sort of just coming out and forcefully saying, this cannot continue or something needs to happen. It's been going on for weeks and it's getting more and more violent.
Donald Trump explicitly, reportedly saying that he won't bring up the Hong Kong protests, if China, delivers in some way in the trade talks. So, that's a quid pro quo, it seems.
But of course, China still needs Hong Kong. It's the world's third biggest financial center. People don't like to trade as much on the Shanghai Stock Exchange. And perhaps that's part of the reason why, for now, it's still one country, two systems.
Absolutely. I think Xi Jinping is an extremely pragmatic ruler, and he, of course, knows that they need Hong Kong. There's no question of them letting that go, or I don't even see them giving them more autonomy at the moment. This is about, I guess, a war of attrition again, just trying to ride this out, hoping the international community will ignore this, continue to ignore this for their own economic reasons, at the same time trying to oppose their own agenda on international diplomacy through economic initiatives such as the new Silk Road, and trying to get kind of more power at a global governance level, try and make the world come around to China's way of seeing things, less attention on human rights, more about connecting up the world economically for China's benefit, and just kind of paving their own path. They see the world as being dominated by old powers, which they think needs to change, and they're going to do that in a very sure but steady way, I think.
There was...
I think there is some good reason why the West is so shy to say something on Hong Kong, and that has much to do with our own profession. When I was covering the Tibet protest 10 years ago, you had to hide your interlocutors, the Tibetans you were talking to, not tell your name or anything, because after the whole thing passed, the Chinese civil service would all cover them and, ask, why did you talk to that foreign journalist? If they don't have a mask now anymore, it's forbidden now, they're all, the pictures of them are all going to be with the Chinese Secret Service, and one day they're going to be, eventually taken hold for or responsible for that, and that makes it so difficult to support these protests openly. If you say just go on, we are behind you, we'll support you, and at the end we can do nothing, and then they are helpless.
So what you're saying is the protests are going to die down at some point?
Well, I think there is really, at least they have a chance maybe to get some, they have already taken down the law. They have already had a big victory there. And they can maybe get something on police behavior, but they're not going to get free elections like they want them, And so they're headed also in a... for trouble, I would say. No? I mean, it's very difficult to, as Western powers, as Western journalists, to tell them, keep on going, keep on fighting Beijing, because we're all behind you. Democrats, we're all behind you.
And it's going to be sort of like you said, it's an attrition thing. It's going to be drip, drip, drip. He knows he can't do another Tiananmen. I do think, Xi Jinping is absolutely furious about what he's seeing. He's probably seething about it. He knows for now he has to sort of leave it in the hands of Carrie Lam, who he didn't allow to resign. He has to leave it in the hands of the Hong Kong security forces. Obviously, there's the barracks of the People's Liberation Army there on Hong Kong Island. They're not going to come out of their barracks. He can't do that, but I do think he has his eyes on 2049. It's the date he mentioned in his speech, right? It's the great national Chinese dream when the territory will be, as he says, fully economically developed and fully unified territorially. So he's thinking
one final point on this. On Monday, on the eve of the 70th anniversary commemorations, Xi Jinping becoming the first sitting Chinese president to visit Mao's mausoleum, bowing 3 times before his remains. Georg Blume, what's your reaction to these images?
But we should just not believe that Xi Jinping is a new Mao. It has nothing to do, his power, with Mao's power. Mao was
some people say this is a risk because Xi Jinping himself suffered under the Cultural Revolution, and the Chinese are ambivalent when it comes to how much you revere Mao.
Yes, but Mao, was a real one-man rulership. Xi Jinping, with these images, what we think often in the West, that he's just his successor now, and he wants to be like Mao. And the Chinese
he does have more power in his own hands than any of his predecessors.
Exactly, and it's the party who has the power, not Xi Jinping.
Even now,
I'm very much convinced to that. That's why we have no actions in Hong Kong right now, except the police. If you would have a one-man rulership, there would be more to see. It's a very complicated 80 million member party system where Xi Jinping is the most important man, but not the only, by far not the only important. And we shouldn't just believe that it's Chinese propaganda to think one man, one system.
All right, and before no edition of The World This Week these days would be complete without news from Hong Kong's former colonial rulers. From London, it's here, something in writing. The European Union studying fervently Boris Johnson's 11th hour proposal to solve the Irish backstop issue. When the week began, the government was touting it as a take it or leave it final proposal to stave off a no-deal Brexit. But by the time Boris Johnson took to the podium Wednesday at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, he was using a different tack.
But this is not an anti-European party. This is not an anti-European country. We are European. We love Europe. I love Europe anyway. I love it.
He loves Europe, Catherine Norris-Trent.
Oh, God. I mean, where do I start with this? I think Boris Johnson is an extremely tactical person, extremely Machiavellian person, and he'll say pretty much whatever it takes to meet his ends. I mean, it's really interesting. If you look at the actual top secret Brexit deal, which they finally published their details of after, more than 3 years, and with just a couple of weeks to go until the nominal extended Brexit day, if you look at it, the European Union have been extremely polite in their reactions about it, saying, all right, well, it's a starting point. There are several big flaws in this plan, which I don't see how the European Union will be able to accept at all. I mean, giving the Northern Ireland Assembly, which hasn't been sitting for more than 2 years.
Since January of 2017.
Right, political disagreements. Giving them a veto on it every 4 years. What happens if they say no? What do we go from there? There's no details on that. And also, how do any kind of businesses or economic actors do that every 4 years? And that'll just be a huge waste of time and money. Or they think, we're not going to have any checks. So, we'll go to maybe traders' locations and check their stuff. But the problem isn't about people who are breaking the law necessarily. The problem is about the smuggling. Smuggling used to be rife between Ireland and Northern Ireland. And if you slap big tariffs or any kind of differentiation in tariffs on these goods going up and down the border, as many, many agricultural products do, how do you not get a huge black market and huge smuggling? And that, of course, involves organised crime, perhaps mobile checkpoints and targets for terror.
I think Catherine was being charitable when she was characterizing the EU reaction. Yes, they've been patient because they don't want to be seen as be made the fall guy. And Boris Johnson would love to apportion the blame. It's the failure of the opposition and the apportioning blame. However, look, it's a scam plan. That's what Europe's really thinking about it. They're trying to go through the motions, make it look like they're giving their due consideration to the plan so that they can't be then, sort of pinned and pegged as the people who just out of hand rejected it, giving it due course. However, look, we've all talked about it, even the vague details, and I'm not even sure if the details actually clarify anything. They actually... Many of them are contradictory and add to the confusion, I believe. But it creates two borders where there were none before. It creates one on the island of Ireland itself, and it creates another, presumably, right down the Irish Sea. It's very confusing. So when Boris Johnson, it's all fine and well for him to speak in these broad platitudes and to stand there and talk about how there'll only be a few minor customs checks and they will be covered either electronically or on the premises of businesses or somewhere else along the supply chain. That does not give anyone a
It's just sheer imagination.
At the end of the day, Reem Mumtaz, it's not about smugglers so much or about technical issues. It's about politics and the Good Friday Agreement, which ended decades of sectarian strife.
I think the clearest response to this has come once again from France. Emmanuel Macron has been saying for months, we have certain guidelines. Among those guidelines is the Good Friday Agreement. It's also the integrity of the single market. These are very important. His Minister for Europe, Amélie de Montchalin, repeated those 2 days ago when she said it wasn't just that, it was also preserving, obviously, norms. So, all of these sort of medical health norms that have been put in place for the single market, and also about making sure that the UK does not become a disloyal competitor at the doorsteps of the EU. And so these are going to guide the reaction of the EU. At the same time, EU diplomats have told one of my colleagues in Brussels that, they've seen this plan come out. They were first trying to figure out if this was just a tactical maneuver in order to play the blame game. or if this was actually a substantial starting point for a negotiation.
Because he started to file for the procedure for which he would have to get that extension on Brexit, which he said he wouldn't do.
Well, this is what's interesting. He actually said he would rather die in a ditch or something like that rather than, file for an extension. Except today we find out that no, he actually has to file the extension. So I wonder, is there an extension in that ditch?
Gail Bloemen, is Boris Johnson, does he want to do a deal? Catherine's not sure, to put it mildly.
As we talk this week on US impeachment, on such an important speech by Boris Johnson, we should believe and think that the real important things are happening now in Brussels, where Germans and French put together a new EU Commission with the Green Deal for Europe, which will really fight climate change and where we're really going to do serious politics. The real scandal is that while we're talking about US impeachment and Boris Johnson, nothing big is happening in Brussels, and there are lazy German and French politicians who are not getting their deal together for real climate change policies, and they're happy because we're talking here about Boris Johnson and US impeachment, because they know, they can just go on and do nothing. And
it's very interesting what you're saying, and that's another thing we've been hearing from the French repeatedly. Macron is sick and tired of having Brexit hold up his entire European sort of approach and agenda. And I think that is going to be... Yeah.
And he's happy too, because he has to do nothing while everybody is talking about Brexit.
And while it's all happening, over at Sotheby's auction house in London, a priceless Brexit moment on Thursday.
8,500,000. You're out? Thank you very much indeed. Are you out, sir? At 8,500,000. I have to hurry you now, sir. At 8,500,000, thank you for your bids. It's here at 8,500,000 and selling. Fair warning now for £8,500,000. Emma, congratulations. Sold.
Banksy's 2009 painting devolved Parliament, fetching a hammer price of £8.5 million. Catherine, if you add the fees, it's £9,879,500.
Well, that's quite a lot of money, isn't it? I mean, I think it sums up a lot of the mood. It's quite sad for me to see that in a way. It sums up a lot of the way that British people feel about politics and politicians and the system in general. And I don't know if that faith can ever be got back.
Did it years ago, right?
That's
it's old. It's an old.
2009.
Yeah,
it's extremely prescient. But
Well,
I'm extremely concerned about the state of British democracy and the way politics is going. And I think it can only lead to, kind of radicalisation of political parties and more extreme points of view and a huge lack of trust in public policy. And it's extremely sad, really.
And it's only made worse by a prime minister who wants to prorogue a parliament, another doesn't want to abide by court rulings. I mean, I thought Britain was like a democracy and one of the most important, oldest, best established democracies.
The mother of parliaments, they used to call it that.
And there's a lot of time between now and October the 31st. I want to thank you, Rim Mumtaz. I want to thank Douglas Herbert, Catherine Norris-Trent, Georg Blume. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And another precinct heard from on this issue is our own Emma James.
Yes, indeed. Where would we be without Brexit? We probably have far more interesting things to talk about.
So let's talk about Brexit then.
OK, why not, if you insist. Yes, a lot of people wondering where it's going to go next. I think my favourite cartoon of the day, though, has to come from Steve Bell in The Guardian. His view seems to be that whatever happens next, it's not going to be the fault of Boris Johnson. He's taking nothing squarely on his own shoulders, because there is Boris Johnson's grave, and you can see his hair on top of the tombstone, bottom sticking up in the air as well for some reason. But you'll notice it says, "It's all your fault." It's called his final words, but "your" is spelt with an EU in the middle. And that is certainly something that a lot of people believe, that he is going to try to make this the EU's fault if he does fail in his bid to get the UK out of the EU by the 31st of October. Now, it does look like there has been something of a U-turn. That's entirely the wrong page, excuse me. Let's try and get the right one. There we go. OK. Yes, it does appear that he has done something of a U-turn, but a lot of people are wondering whether it really is or not, because he has told Scottish Court that he will apply for an extension should an agreement not be reached by the 19th of October, something that he has said up until now he definitely would not do. Is it deeply embarrassing or part of a cunning plan? This is the question being asked by many, many people out there. This gentleman saying, "Hi, I'm Boris Johnson. I would rather be dead in a ditch than ask for an extension to Brexit. Anyway, as I was saying, please may you grant us an extension." It really is incredibly hypocritical. A newspaper editor, Kevin Maguire, says, "I think we can guess which liar's face will be carved on turnips and pumpkins by both Remainers and Leavers this Halloween, with happily Britain going nowhere on the 31st of October." Very optimistic view that this means Brexit doesn't mean Brexit anymore.
Okay.
However, he's right that a lot of people on both sides are not happy right now with what's going on. This is another take on it. The riots are coming. This is obviously a nod to the fact that many people believe that those who want to leave the EU are perhaps of the older persuasion. And if Brexit doesn't happen, well, a lot of people have suggested there could be violence on the streets. This is interesting. A Conservative MP, Steve Baker, says, "A source confirms all this means is that the government will obey the law. It does not mean we will extend.
Right.
It does not mean we will stay in the EU beyond October the 31st. We will leave."
So there'll be a deal.
Well, what does he mean? No one quite knows. Everyone's asking him and he hasn't answered it. And it does add fuel to the fire, this idea that somewhere in the background is some sneaky plan where they're going to work their way around the law and get everyone, take everyone by surprise, really. This person wondering whether Hungary will veto it.
Okay.
It's been going around.
So there you go. That would take Boris Johnson off the hook. The great Brexit heist bang on schedule. Why Hungary, you may ask? And it's something a lot of people are talking about because the foreign minister has just had a visit to London. He is known to be very friendly with Boris Johnson, as is the ambassador. So a lot of people are wondering if Hungary could veto. However, would that really serve their purpose? This person, among many, saying, "I find it hard to believe that Hungary would want to rock the boat. They want to stay in the EU. Why would they want to annoy everyone except for Boris Johnson?"
Right. And we were talking about Banksy earlier. Jeff Koons is getting a lot of publicity here, but not always as favorable.
Not at all favourable, I think it's fair to say. I have been searching for favourable things. They're few and far between.
Right.
His sculpture, which you see here, the bunch of tulips held aloft by a hand, has been finally installed in Paris. The design behind it, or the idea behind it, was that it was an homage to victims of terrorism in this country. But there's been resistance to it from the very beginning, and it very nearly didn't happen. A letter was written to Libération, the French newspaper, last year, saying no to the present from Jeff Koons. Present is in inverted commas because he was only actually gifting the concept. He wasn't gifting the reality. And so 3.5 million euros was raised by French and American donors to pay for this. Jeff Koons apparently put in $1 million himself as well. But what a lot of victims are unhappy about, or victims groups, in particular Life for Paris, which represents those who died on the 13th of November 2015, they say that that money could have been put to so much better use because they have a tiny budget and they're really trying to help the genuine victims. And a lot of people really very angry, and a lot don't like the look of the sculpture either.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's the question, is it art? Many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.